Hello everybody, this is Antonio Wolf. Today we are reading Hegel's essay, The Scientific Ways of Treating Natural Law, Its Place in Moral Philosophy, and Its Relation to the Positive Sciences of Law. So this was written in 1803, if I remember correctly. So it's a pretty early work, relatively speaking. This is before the Phenomenology of Spirit. And many people do not read the stuff Hegel writes before he kind of gets going with the system. Anyways, so I'm interested in reading this, mainly because I listened to a video in which somebody was reading Mises on natural law. And where am I going? And Mises is not very bright, not very intelligent, and I was like, why would anybody read Mises on anything? You could be reading Hegel. And then I'm like, Hegel actually has a paper on natural law, so let's read it. So, continuing, this is the introduction. The science of natural law, like other sciences such as mechanics and physics, has long been recognized as an essentially philosophical science, and since philosophy must have parts, as an essential part of philosophy. But with the other sciences, it has shared a common fate. The philosophical element in philosophy is assigned exclusively to metaphysics, while the sciences have been allowed little share in it. On the contrary, in their special principle, they have been kept aloof in complete independence of the idea. In the end, the sciences cited as examples have been compelled more or less to confess their removal from philosophy. As a result, they acknowledge that what is commonly called experience is their scientific principle, and therefore they renounce their claim to be genuine sciences. They are content to consist of a collection of empirical observations and to make use of the categories of the understanding only as appliance, without wishing to assert anything objective. Well, I very much feel that sentiment. While it's true, it's also not true. Because they're like, oh, well, we're not claiming we know the absolute truth. We're just saying, you got to believe us, Because we do the science and you don't. Look, they are Higgs bosons. You know why? This equation tells me that they are so. We spent billions on a useless machine that proves nothing. But believe us. Give us more of your money. FYI, if anyone in the comments wants to comment me about the Higgs boson, bring it. There's much argument to be had about that. Bringing up equations and all that jazz will do nothing for you.
They're just going to snort in derision.
That was a good one. I'm sorry.
Sorry,
it's a reference only we understand. If originally against its will, what had called itself a philosophical science was shut out of philosophy, and generally the category of science, if in the end it has accepted this position, the reason for this exclusion is not that, although these so-called sciences issued from philosophy itself, they failed to maintain a conscious connection with it. For every part of philosophy is capable in its individuality of being an independent science, acquiring a complete inner necessity of its own, since it is the absolute which makes philosophy a genuine science. In this form, the absolute alone is the special principle which lies above the sphere of science's knowledge and freedom, and by relation to this principle, the science is possessed by an external necessity. Oh, there, Danny knows about it. Thank you, Danny. In this form, the absolute alone is the special principle which lies above the sphere of science's knowledge and freedom, and by relation to this principle, the science is possessed by an external necessity. But the idea itself remains free of this determinacy, and it can be reflected in this determinate science, just as purely as absolute life is expressed in every living thing, though the scientific element in such a science, or its inner irrationality, does not come to light in the pure form of the idea, which is the essence of every science, and which in philosophy, as the absolute science, is present as this pure idea. Of this independent and yet free scientific development of a science, geometry supplies a brilliant example that is the envy of the other sciences. All the same, it does not follow that sciences like those mentioned above must be denied all reality, because they are, strictly speaking, empirical. For just each part or aspect of philosophy is capable of being an independent science, so each such science is thus immediately an independent and perfect picture, and in the form of a picture can be accepted and expounded by an intuition which purely and happily keeps itself free from contamination by fixed concepts. I would say something to do. Continuing, but the perfection of the science requires not only that perception and picture be united with the logical element and taken up into the purely ideal, but also that the separate, though genuine, science be stripped of its separateness. Its principle must be recognized in its higher context and necessity, and thus, and only thus, be completely freed. In this way alone is it possible to know the limits of the science, and without this principle the science must remain ignorant of its limits, because otherwise it would have to be superior to itself and recognize the nature of its principle according to its determinate character in the absolute form. For from this knowledge the science would derive directly the knowledge and certainty of the extent of the equality of its very specifications. But as it is, its attitude to its own limits can only be empirical, and it must now make vain attempts to go beyond them, now think them narrower than they are, and thus experience wholly unexpected extensions of scope, as happens even in geometry, which, for example, can prove the incommensurability of the diameter and the side of the square, but not that of the diameter and the circumference of a circle. And even more in arithmetic, and most of all geometry and arithmetic in combination provide the greatest example of science fumbling in the dark along its borders. I love when Hegel shits on math, because people still believe that math is like the greatest science. Well, in the Anglosphere, most people don't even consider math science, but insofar as it's tied to science, people view the validity of science according to its mathematicity. See a footnote in the introduction to his Naturrecht. Fichte makes much of the simplicity of insight into the reason for this latter incommensurability. Curved is in fact just not straight. The superficiality of this reason is obvious at once, and it is also refuted immediately by the former incommensurability, diagonal and side of the square, because both of these are straight lines, and also by the square of the parabola. As for the help sought in the same context from healthy common sense against the mathematical infinite, that, quote, a many-angled figure with an infinite number of sides cannot be measured simply because it is a many-angled figure with an infinite number of sides, end quote. The very same resource would have to be available again against the infinite progression in which the absolute idea is supposed to be realized, and B, by this means there is no settling whether the chief thing at issue, positive infinity, which is identity, not an infinite multitude, is to be granted. And this is as good as saying that nothing is settled either concerning commensurability or incommensurability. So if we define straight lines as that which is not curved, we're not doing very much at all. The critical philosophy has had the important negative effect on theoretical sciences of proving that the scientific element in them is not objective, but belongs to a middle realm between nothing and reality, to a mixture of being and not being, and thus making them admit that they belong only to the sphere of empirical thinking. The positive effect of critical philosophy has turned out all the poorer in proportion, and it has not been able to recover these sciences for philosophy. Well, that's a ringing endorsement right there. You know, the negative effects have been pretty bad. The positive effects have been worse. On the other hand, the critical philosophy has placed the absolute wholly within practical philosophy, and there critical philosophy is positive or dogmatic knowledge. We must regard the critical philosophy, which also calls itself transcendental idealism in general, and particularly in natural law, as the culminating point of that opposition which, like circles on the surface of water, spreading outward concentrically from the point where the surface was disturbed and finally in small movements, losing their relation to a center and going on ad infinitum, from feeble beginnings in early scientific endeavors, outgrew the confinement of barbarism and became ever greater until it reached understanding of itself in the critical philosophy by means of the absolute concept of infinity, and as infinity now also cancelled itself. The earlier ways of treating natural law, and also what would have to be regarded as its previous principles, must therefore be denied all significance for the essence of science, because their element is opposition and negativity, yet not absolute negativity, that is, infinity, which alone is the element for science. On the contrary, they no more possess the purely positive than they do the purely negative, but are mixtures of both. Only one curious about the history of science would be interested enough to linger over them in order, first, to compare them with the absolute idea, and to discern in their distortion the necessity whereby, intertwined with a determinate principle, the moments of absolute form are distortedly displayed, and yet dominate these attempts even under the dominion of a narrow principle, and second, to see the empirical condition of the world reflected in the ideal mirror of science. As for the second, it is of course true that since all things are interconnected, empirical existence and the condition of all sciences will express also the condition of the world. But the condition of natural law will do so in particular because natural law bears directly on the ethical, the mover of all things human, and insofar as the sciences of ethics has an existence, it is under the necessity of being one with the empirical shape of the ethical, a shape equally necessary. And as science, natural law must express that shape in the form of universality. Yeah, okay. So, natural law, whatever it may be, will not be completely unhinged from the empirical, but the empirical also not completely unhinged from it. As for the first, the only true distinction that can be acknowledged as marking the principle of the science is whether the science lies within the absolute, or outside absolute unity, that is, in opposition. If the latter, it simply could not be science if its principle were not some incomplete and relative unity or the concept of a relation, even if the principle were only the empty abstraction of relation itself under the name of an attractive force or the force of identity. In science, whose principle is not a concept, in sciences, whose principle is not a concept of relation, or only the empty force of identity, there remains nothing ideal except the first ideal relation, the way the child is different from the world, as with the form of picture thinking, in which the sciences place empirical qualities and can rehearse the variety. These sciences would be called preeminently empirical sciences. All right, let me see. Just reading this quickly. If the latter is simply, which is outside the absolute unity, it simply could not be science if its principle were not some incomplete and relative unity, or the concept of a relation, even if the principle were only the empty abstraction of relation itself under the same attractive force of identity. Okay, so insofar as anything is a science, it's a science precisely because it unifies. If your science is a disunified science, in which it's basically a pure taxonomy, for example, and even then, taxonomy would unite it as a science. So it couldn't even be that. It would just be the particulars without any connection whatsoever. And obviously it would not be a science. So he says, but even if we get rid of that, in sciences whose principle is not a concept of relation or only the empty force of identity, there remains nothing ideal except the first ideal relation, the way the child is different from the world, as with the form of picture thinking, in which the sciences place empirical qualities and can rehearse the variety. These sciences would be called preeminently empirical sciences. But because practical sciences bear by their nature some real universal, or on a unity which is a unity of differences, the feelings too must comprise in practical empiricism not pure qualities but relations, be they negative like the urge to self-preservation, or positive like love and hate, sociability, and the like. And a more scientific empiricism differs from this pure empiricism, not in general by having as its object relations rather than qualities, but rather by fixing these relations in conceptual form and clinging to this negative absoluteness, though without severing this form of unity from its content. These we will call empirical sciences, while we term a purely formal science that form of science in which the opposition of form and content is absolute, and pure unity or infinity, the negative absolute, is wholly separated from the content and posited independently. So the preeminently empirical sciences would just be our immediately phenomenal relation to the world. The world is the world, that which is not us, and then we are we, and we are observers in that. And then Hegel says you can't even have pure empirical sciences like that, even if you wanted to, because you have interests, you have cognitions, which are leading you hither and thither to unite things, even through the bare thread of the desires we have in relationship to them. And then there are the formal sciences, which would be stuff like taxonomy, I suppose, in which, you at least bring the form of unity onto it, but you can't explain the unity as such. So, it's one thing to just have the collection of the bones, structures, and muscle structures of the human being, and the organs and whatnot, and then you say, these constitute the human being. But in order to have a genuine science for Hegel, you would have to show how the human being, as a human being of its own, generates all these parts, and these parts therefore turn back and, as being the parts that they are, allow for the being of the other parts, and then generate the entirety of the whole as well. Although there is thus established between the two spurious ways of treating natural law scientifically a specific difference whereby the principles of the one are relations and mixtures of empirical perception with the universal, while the principle of the other is absolute opposition and absolute universality, it is obvious nonetheless that the ingredients of both empirical perception and concept are the same, and that formalism, in passing over from its pure negation to a content, can likewise arrive at nothing else than relations or relative identities. Because the purely ideal or the opposition is absolutely posited, the absolute idea and unity cannot be present. With the principle of absolute opposition, or of the absoluteness of the purely ideal, the absolute principle of empiricism is posited, and therefore with reference to perception, the syntheses, insofar as they are not supposed to have just the purely negative meaning of annulling one side of the opposition, but also a positive meaning of perception, portray only empirical perceptions. These two ways of treating natural law scientifically must first of all excuse me. These two ways of treating natural law scientifically must, first of all, be characterized in more detail. The first with reference to the manner in which the absolute idea appears in it according to moments of absolute form. The second with reference to the manner in which the infinite or the negative absolute vainly attempts to achieve a positive organization. The analysis of the latter attempt will lead directly to treating the nature and relation of the sciences of the ethical as philosophical sciences, and to their relation with what is called the positive science of law. The latter holds itself aloof from philosophy, and by voluntarily renouncing philosophy, imagines that it can avoid philosophy's criticism, yet it also claims to have absolute subsistence in true reality, a pretension not to be condoned. As for that way of treating natural law which we have called empirical, the first point is that we cannot concern ourselves with a matter of determinacies and relational concepts, which it seizes upon and asserts under the name of principles. On the contrary, The separation and fixation of determinacies is just what must be negated. The nature of this separation implies that the scientific procedure applies only to the form of unity, and in an organic relation to the manifold qualities into which the unity is divided, if they are not simply to be enumerated, one certain determinate aspect must be emphasized in order to reach a unity over this multiplicity, and that the determinate aspect must be regarded as the essence of the relation, but the totality of the organic is precisely what cannot thereby be attained, and the remainder of the relation, excluded from the determinate aspect that was selected, falls under the dominion of this aspect, which is elevated to be the essence and purpose of the relation. Thus, for example, to explain the relation of marriage, procreation, the holding of goods in common, or something else is proposed as determinate, and from such a determinate aspect is made prescriptive as the essence of the relation. The whole organic relation is delimited and contaminated. So, Ivo Sykes says the reason we do everything we do is because, our genes want us to reproduce them. So, marriage, it's not because of this thing called love. Really, it's just these genes pushing you on the machine. Kids, you don't love your kids. That's just your genes talking. Property, you don't actually care about that. That's not important. You just have that because it's survival of the fittest. It's a social strategy that works better than others. That's why we have it. Or in a more concrete sense, perhaps one may say, it's like those people, it's the other side of evolutionary psychology, wherein everything we do in social life is really because we want to have sex. Everything we do is to impress the opposite sex, and if we're not doing that, then clearly there's something wrong with us. Or in the case of punishment, one specific aspect is singled out. The criminal's moral reform, or the damage done, or the effect of his punishment on others, and the criminal's own notion of the punishment before he committed the crime, or the necessity of making this notion a reality by carrying out the threat, etc. And then some such single aspect is made the purpose and essence of the whole. The natural consequence is that, since such a specific aspect has no necessary connection with the other specific aspects which can be found and distinguished, there arises an endless struggle to find the necessary bearing and predominance of one over the others. And since inner necessity, non-existent and singularity is missing, each aspect can perfectly well vindicate its independence of the others. So, here we can, for any science, for any explanation we wish to give, we can just pick out any particular we want and determine, say, well, I think this is the essence. And we can give an account of that, and sometimes a better or worse account that seems to fit more with the general facts. But ultimately, we can't really have arguments about what is really the primary reason or cause or explanation of anything, because there are various causes and explanations which anybody can take for whatever reason. Such qualities taken up out of the multiplicity of the relation into which the organic is fragmented by empirical and inadequately reflective perception and put into the form of conceptual unity are what knowledge of this kind calls essence and purposes. And since their form of the concept is expressed as the absolute being of the specific character constituting the content of the concept, they are set up as principles, laws, duties, etc. Of this conversion of the absoluteness of pure form, which however is negative absoluteness or pure identity, the pure concept, infinity, into the absoluteness of the content, and the determinacy taken into the form, more will be said in connection with the principle of the critical philosophy. In the empirical knowledge which is here in question, this conversion comes about unconsciously, while the critical philosophy enters upon it reflectively and as absolute reason and duty. This formal unity into which the determinacy is placed by thinking also provides the appearance of that necessity which science strives for. For the unity of opposites in relation to science, regarded as a real unity, is science's necessity. But because the matter of this formal unity is not the whole of the opposites, but only one of them, that is, only one determinacy, the necessity too is only formal and analytic, and is concerned only with the form of an identical or analytic proposition, in which the determinacy can be presented. But by this absoluteness of the proposition and absoluteness of content too is smuggled in this way laws and principles are constituted. Excuse me. So there are formal ways in which we can unify things without actually showing a proper unity at all, without proving it. For example, it's the process of abstraction where you go, well, there are people, or there are individuals, what these individuals share. For example, it may be that they are part of the human species. And then you go one level up about it. And what people with human species share really is that they share the capacity for reason. And then you go one level higher. And then you could unify all these distinct things, which may be opposed at a certain relative level. But, you can say, yeah, but they all share this in common. They're unified by it. That still doesn't show like an act. This doesn't really prove the necessity of the relationships between that universal and the individuals beyond an analytic approach, in which the universal still is only a formal side and the individuals are the content side. And for Hegel, you need to have a form which as a form will produce the content, and a content which as content will produce the form. And then they form a circular account in which it will be absolute by the fact that the universal and the individual will, in the account, refer to, lead to each other without any necessity to bring anything external into the account. That's when you know you have an absolute account. But as empirical science finds itself surrounded by a multiplicity of such principles, laws, ends, duties, and rights, none of which is absolute, and thus is bound also to conceive the picture of and need for the absolute unity of all these disconnected characteristics and of an original simple necessity, we are considering how it will satisfy this demand rooted in reason, or how the absolute idea of reason will be displayed in its moments when it is under the domination of what, for this empirical knowledge, is the inseparable opposition of the one and the many. For one thing, it is interesting in itself to discern in this scientific endeavor and its murky medium not only the reflection, the domination of the absolute, but also its perversion. For another thing, the forms which the moments of the absolute have received here turn into a species of prejudices and indubitable and universally vowed thought, whose nullity criticism must expose in order to justify science for ignoring them. This proof of their nullity is presented most convincingly by showing the unreal basis and ground from which they grow, and whose flavor and nature they absorb. Sorry, just checking some messages here. Okay, wait a minute. Where was I? I don't know why this PDF is being janky, like it's being very jumpy when I try to scroll up or down. There we go. At first, empirical science envisages scientific totality as a totality of the multiplex, or as completeness, while a strict formalism envisages it as consistency. The former can at will elevate its experiences to universality and can push the consistency of its putative determinations up to the point where other empirical matter, which contradicts the first but has just as much right to be excogitated and expressed as a principle. Well, I've never seen that specific word, excogitated. Is it like expose? Excogitate, think out, plan, or devise. I will add that to my vocabulary repertoire.
You know what's funny? So I had my mic muted, but right as you were saying that, I actually said it at the exact same time.
That's good. Welcome. So let me just read the whole sentence. The former can at will elevate its experiences to universality and can push the consistency of its putative determinations up to the point where other empirical matter, which contradicts the first but has just as much right to be excogitated and expressed as a principle, no longer leaves room for the consistency of the preceding and compels its abandonment. Formalism can extend its consistency so far as is generally made possible by the emptiness of its principle, or by a content which it has smuggled in, but thereby it is in turn entitled to exclude what lacks completeness from its a priorism and its science, and proudly revile it as the empirical. For formalism asserts its formal principles as the a priori and absolute, and thus asserts that what it cannot master by the ease is non-absolute and accidental, unless it saves itself by finding the empirical field generally, and in the movement from one characteristic to another, the formal transition of progression from the conditioned to the conditioned, and since the latter is in turn conditioned, so on ad infinitum. In this process, formalism not only abandons all its advantages over what it calls empiricism, rather, since in the context of the conditioned with the conditioned, these opposites are posited as subsisting absolutely, formalism itself is completely submerged in empirical necessity, and by means of the formal identity or negative absolute, whereby it holds opposites together, endows the empirical necessity with a resemblance of genuine absoluteness. Okay, let me reread that. Why does this saying jump so much?
Hello? I think my Discord messed up. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, I can hear.
So I was gonna ask, how is Hegel using genuine in this context?
It's just the general, usual context.
Oh, so to like emphasize, it's sort of like if someone says, you know, there is this muffin, right? But this store sells the true muffins or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Alright, rereading that from the top. At first, empirical science envisages scientific totality as a totality of the multiplex or as completeness. While a strict formalism envisages it as consistency.
And the formalism of Hegel's day would be from the laws of thought, so, you know, since they show consistency, or at least attempt to, this would make sense in that context.
I'm just trying to think about what he's distinguishing here. Empirical sciences envisage scientific totality as a totality of the multiplex or completeness. I suppose that would be like a completeness of account of just like the...
I think he might mean of like every last thing. So like endless that'd be like a naming every animal and stuff like that, maybe.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking of. While strict formalism envisages it as consistency. The former, empirical science, can at will elevate its experiences to universality and can push the consistency of its putative determinations up to the point where other empirical matter, which contradicts the first but has just as much right to be excogitated and expressed as a principle, no longer leaves room for the consistency of the preceding and compels its abandonment. So I'm trying to think of like an example of where this would be the case, where they attempt to account for every particular in the consideration would compel you to abandon the consistency of the proceeding. Let me continue for this. Formalism can extend its consistency so far as is generally made possible by the emptiness of its principle, or by a content which it has smuggled in, but thereby it is in turn entitled to exclude what lacks completeness from its a priorism in its science, and proudly revile it as the empirical. For formalism asserts its formal principles as the a priori and absolute, and thus asserts that what it cannot master by these is non-absolute and accidental. For the experience that the account of completeness that would destroy the formality of a prior account, I suppose maybe we can go with the example of art. Actually, art is probably a perfect example. That insofar as what we want to account for is all the empirical ways that people use the term art and what they mean by art. And say that we will derive from that empirical set of data what we mean by art. Then the more we expand it to all these empirical circumstances, we find that we get a lot of weird shit that doesn't actually come together at all. There's contradictory positions and whatnot, and so the only way to keep it coherent is to keep loosening the definition and loosening even more, because the prior, we're compelled to abound in the consistency of any prior account, because insofar as somebody uses the term art in a new way, we have to re-account for that in our scientific account. I don't know, you guys think that makes sense? That seems to be what it's going with here.
That sounds plausible to me. It's kind of tricky.
Formalism can extend its consistency so far as generally made possible by the emptiness of its principle. And then the formalism part is an equally easy example. We can just go ahead and say and define a priori things, and if they don't cohere with what is existent at all, such as we define the good, for example, as something completely unlike anything at all that is empirically available. Formalism can only maintain itself insofar as it just denies the content which it wishes to explain by denying the very content that is available to explain. Unless it saves itself by finding in the empirical field generally and in the movement from one characteristic to another the formal transition of progression from the conditioned to the condition, and since the latter is an eternal condition, and so on ad infinitum. I suppose that's sort of Leibnizian deductions from metaphysics to special metaphysics. General metaphysics to special metaphysics. Which then some people might then use to try to derive actual empirical particulars. Write in general. Don't write in text, please.
Oh yeah. What confuses me for a second is that a lot of spaces I'm in, the general chat is called text channel or something.
All those people are weirdos, and they shouldn't call it text.
How dare those people?
Any writing is text.
Alright.
Okay, in this process, formalism not only abandons all its advantages over what it calls empiricism, rather in the context of the conditioned with the conditioned, these opposites are posited as subsisting absolutely. Formalism itself completely submerged in empirical necessity and by means of formal identity, or negative absolute, whereby it holds opposite together, endows empirical necessity with a resemblance of genuine absoluteness. So insofar as like a formalism radically negates and keeps itself away from the empirical, it thereby implicitly recognizes the empirical as having an absoluteness independent of formalism. Yeah, it's like when, like in theology, where certain kinds of monism say, well, only God exists, and all this finite stuff, including us, we're just illusions. Well, nonetheless, then the illusion exists, and then now you set up a barrier between the absolute and this other strange thing on the side, which is an illusion which seems equally absolute unto itself. But this linking of consistency with the completeness of the picture, whether the latter more complete, formal and empty consistency, or the former consistency which, with specific concepts as principles, proceeds from one of them to others and is consistent only in inconsistency, immediately alters the place of multiplicity in pure empiricism. Just to bring it up, Hegel is a master of consistent inconsistency. For pure empiricism, everything has equal rights with everything else. One characteristic is as real as another, and none has precedence. We shall return to this point later when we compare pure empiricism with our present topic, scientific empiricism. In this formal totality, you must consider... Oh, no. Oh, there we go. In this formal totality, you must consider how absolute unity appears both as simple unity, which we may call the original unity, and as totality in the mirror of empirical knowing. Both unities, which are one in the absolute and whose identity is the absolute, must occur in such knowledge as separate and different from one another. As for absolute unity, as that essence of necessity which is for appearance as an external bond, the first point is that empiricism can have nothing to say about it, for in the unity which is the essential one, the multiplex is immediately annihilated and is null. Since multiplex being is the principle of empiricism, empiricism is precluded from pressing on to the absolute nullity of its qualities, which for it are absolute, and which besides, owing to the concept in accordance with which they are many, are infinitely many. This original unity can therefore mean, so far as possible, only a single simple and small mass of qualities, whereby it believes it can suffice for a knowledge of the rest. In that ideal empiricism, in which what thus passes vaguely for capricious and accidental is blurred, and the smallest indispensable mass of the multiplex is posited, it is chaos in the physical as in the ethical world. Chaos in the latter is conceived now by the imagination more in the image of existence, as the state of nature, now by the empirical psychology more in the form of potentiality and abstraction, as a list of the capacities found in man, as the nature and destiny of man. In this way, what on the one hand is asserted to be simply necessary in itself, absolute, is at the same time acknowledged to be simply necessary in itself. Absolute is at the same time... Excuse me. Let me read that. In this way, what on the one hand is asserted to be simply necessary in itself, absolute, is at the same time acknowledged on the other hand to be something not real, purely imaginary, and ens rationis. In the first case to be fiction, in the second a mere possibility. And this is the harshest contradiction. Good old Hegel, he can take anything and turn it into an epistemological and ontological problem. Just these pure metaphysical categories. And then come right back and say, look, this is the problem. Let me read this because I kind of lost myself in reading it. So, as for absolute unity, as that essence of necessity, which for appearance is an external bond, the first point is that empiricism can have nothing to say about it. For in the unity, which is the essential one, the multiplex is immediately annihilated and is null. Since multiplex being is the principle of empiricism, empiricism is precluded from pressing on to the absolute unity of its qualities, which for it are absolute, and which besides, owing to the concept in accordance to which they are many, are infinitely many. Alright, so you know that empiricism can say nothing about unities. Seems pretty spot on. I assume that the low down reference here is the implicit references to David Hume and his critiques of unities like causality and such. You know, I mean, Hume didn't believe in the self either. Which, you know, if you don't believe in the self, what do you believe in as any unity? You know, it was just a bundle of perceptions, as he said. You know, these qualities or experiences, which themselves are just bundles and qualities of other experiences. This original unity can therefore mean, so far as possible, only a single, simple, and small mass of qualities, whereby it believes it can suffice for a knowledge of the rest. In that ideal empiricism in which what thus passes vaguely for capricious and accidental is blurred, and the smallest indispensable mass of the multiplex is posited, it is chaos in the physical as well as the ethical world. So, since empiricism denies absolute unity of the world, but nonetheless it can't even operate as empiricism without giving some leeway to unities, it has to choose some kind of relative unities. So, the smallest indispensable mass of multiplex is posited. It is chaos in the physical as well as the ethical world. Chaos in the latter, the ethical world, is conceived now by the imagination more in the image of existence, as the state of nature, now by empirical psychology more in the form of potentiality and abstraction, as a list of capacities found in man as the nature and destiny of man. Okay, so this is an interesting, and I think it does actually work, argument that the very multiplicity of empiricism forces the empiricist to take a stance on the state of nature concerning politics and ethical stances, because what else would they originate from? Where else would what else is it that we empirically see? I mean, empirically we see individuals that do struggle against each other, that are, and we imagine and we can extrapolate that if we take away the state or society as these given rules and norms, then it would be a war of all against all in some kind of way. It would be chaos. So that makes sense.
I just wanted to ask or interject. I don't mean to dress down Hegel's prose, but I think that this can be understood in a more simple way. That it's particularly a lot of discourse around social issues, one will just be told that something is a social construct, and it'll just be left that. And I feel like that kind of intonation is exactly what Hegel is taking aim at here, where there's no account for even the unity of the concept, right? The parts of the concept, no real account given. It's just acknowledged at once as a necessary axiom or something like that, but also something belonging purely to imagination, which is of course a contradiction. The imagination can have no necessity whatsoever, or else it wouldn't be fiction, right? It wouldn't be imaginary. Is that the more or less a correct way of understanding him in this passage?
Yes, I would say that fits perfectly well with this issue. That insofar as we take the position that there's just a multiple of positions, insofar as anybody has any position, well, that's just an arbitrary social construct based on the conditions that they have. And any social construct can be constructed, and from that realization itself, nothing positive comes about. You can't say what is a proper construct or what is not. All right, so for the ordinary understanding, skipped it. In this way, what on the one hand is asserted to be simply necessary in itself, absolute, is at the same time acknowledged on the other hand to be something not real, purely imaginary, and ens rationis. In the first case to be fiction, in the second to be a possibility. And this is the harshest contradiction. And there you go, that goes exactly with the social construct point. For the ordinary understanding, which holds to the murky confusion of what is essential with the transitory, nothing is more understandable than its ability to find the essential thing in this way, namely that by separating out everything capricious and accidental from the confused picture of the state of law, it must, after this abstraction, be left directly with the absolutely necessary. If we think away everything that someone's obscure inkling may reckon against the particular and transitory, as belonging to particular manners, to history, to civilization, and even to the state, then what remains is man in the image of the bare state of nature, or the abstraction of man with his essential potentialities, and we have only to look in order to find what is necessary. By the way, for those of you listening who don't know, law and right in German are the same word, correct? So insofar as it's talking about law here, it's also talking about right. Like the right of free speech, right of the family, but then it's also...
No.
Yeah?
There is like I don't know what word he's using in the original German, but there is a distinction between Gesetz and Recht.
Oh, is there? Well, I know they're tied,
There is.
because I've read that they are.
They're tied, but there is a distinction.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you, Josh. Well, there you go, people. Never mind what I said. Oh, weird. Hate this thing. Why does it skip pages? Okay. What is seen to be connected with the state must therefore also be abstracted, because the chaotic picture of the necessary cannot contain absolute unity, but only simple multiplicity. Atoms with the fewest possible properties, and so what can fall under the concept of a linking and ordering of these, the weakest unity of which the principle of multiplicity is capable, is therefore excluded as something that only comes later and is added on to that multiplicity. So, let me see. Let me reread that. For the ordinary understanding, which holds to the murky confusion of what is essential with the transitory, nothing is more understandable than its ability to find the essential thing in this way, namely that by separating out everything capricious and accidental from the confused picture of the state of law, it must, after this abstraction, be left directly with the absolute necessary. If we think away everything that someone's obscure inkling may reckon amongst the particular territory as belonging to particular manners, to history, to civilization, and even the state, then what remains is man in the image of the bare state of nature, or the abstraction of man with his essential potentialities. Okay, makes perfect sense. Now, in the separation of unity from multiplicity, empiricism lacks in the first place all criteria for drawing the boundary between the accidental and the necessary. That is, for determining what in the chaos of the state of nature or in the abstraction of man must remain and what must be discarded. In this matter, the guiding determinant can only be that as much must remain as is required for the exposition of what is found in the real world. The governing principle for this a priori is the a posteriori. If something in the idea of the state of law is to be justified, all that is required for the purpose of demonstrating its own necessity and its connection with what is original and necessary is to transfer into the chaos inappropriate quality or capacity, and in the manner of all the sciences based on the empirical, to make, for purposes of so-called explanation of reality, hypotheses in which this reality is posited in the same determinate character, though only in a formal, ideal shape, as force, matter, capacity, etc. Any of these is very readily made intelligible and explicable in terms of the other. So let me just reread this. If something in the idea of the state of law is to be justified, all that is required for the purpose of demonstrating its own necessity and its connection with what is original and necessary is to transfer into the chaos inappropriate quality or capacity in the manner of all the sciences based on the empirical, to make, for purposes of so-called explanation of reality, hypotheses in which this reality is posited in the same determinate character, though only in a formal ideal shape, as force, matter, capacity, etc. Okay, so this is just the way in which you take what is given and you make a justification for it, which will then obviously then appear in what is given, and that then sets a justification. It's like there must be such a thing as gravity, because if there wasn't gravity, then things would not fall down when you throw them up. But things being thrown up and falling down is exactly the phenomenon we call gravity. And therefore, obviously, just by the mere appearance of it, of course there's gravity, but we haven't explained what gravity is. So we haven't said anything meaningful at all. In one way, this obscure inkling of original and absolute unity, which is expressed in the chaos of the state of nature and in the abstraction of capacities and inclinations, does not achieve absolute negative unity, but aims only at the extinction of a large multitude of particularities and oppositions. Always keep... whenever you see this in Hegel, always keep an eye out for that, because... negative absolutes, negative unity, concept, same thing. Idea also usually very closely related and nearly the same thing. Suppose if one must give an example of negative unity, it's like two material bodies separated by space. One may say that the space between them which separates them is also the very condition of their being. If there wasn't space separating them, they wouldn't even be bodies. So in being distinct, these bodies are in a negative unity. And they could not be without the negative unity. But there remains over and above in this chaos an indeterminable multitude of qualitative specifications which in themselves have only an empirical necessity and not an inner necessity for one another. They are only related as many, and since the many are many for one another but without unity, they are destined to be self-opposed and to be in absolute conflict with one another. The separate energies of the ethical sphere must, in the state of nature or in the abstraction of man, be thought of as engaged in a war of mutual destruction. But for this very reason, it is easy to show that since these qualities are flatly opposed to one another, and so are purely ideal, they cannot subsist, as they are supposed to, in this ideality and separation, but simply cancel each other out and are reduced to nullity. But empiricism cannot attain to this absolute reflection or to an insight into the nullity of the characteristics in the absolute simple. The many nullities remain for it a mass of realities. But to this multiplicity, the positive unity, expressing itself as absolute totality, must for empiricism be tacked on as something other than alien, and even this form of the linkage of the two sides of absolute identity implies that their totality will be displayed just as murkily and impurely as that of the original unity. I don't know why, I'm not surprised, but I don't know why I didn't expect this, that this would be heavily tied with like his interest before, because this is published before the Phenomenology of Spirit, and this is a time which Hegel was mostly and specifically strongly interested in the problems of skepticism and the issues of epistemology and ontology related to that. So that an essay on natural law is so heavily tied with its relationship to epistemology is not surprising at all. But for people who normally read about these things, this may be surprising, because I'm not the stuff that I've read before, not that I've read that much about from political philosophy. All I ever read, for the most part, has been Marxist, and the stuff that I had to read in the one political philosophy class that I took, which at the time I hated, about 12 years ago. Read Locke, read Hume, well, a little bit of Hume related to that. Read, what's his name? Leviathan dude, Hobbes.
Thomas Hobbes.
Rousseau.
Yeah, read Rousseau.
Montesquieu.
Wait, what about the Prince?
Yes, I did read The Prince. I actually didn't read The Prince in that class. I read The Prince in a humanities class on culture. Funny enough.
I mean, obviously you've read bits and pieces of Plato and Aristotle on politics.
Yeah, I read The Republic on... Well, I read part of The Republic on that. I think about half of it. And then some modern people who I didn't find very interesting. But anyways, in all that I read, nobody ever treated this issue in that way. In this way of like tying it directly to an epistemology or an ontology. As a matter of fact, I've never seen it treated in this way. I've seen it, at least for example, from the Marxists, and even from most Hegelians, they will treat this through ontology by saying, oh, well, if you have an atomistic view of metaphysics, of course you will get the consequence of, the state of nature as the war of all against all. I've never seen anybody attach the epistemologies to this. But what he's doing makes sense. He's making a pretty good argument for why empiricism proper would lead you to this view.
It's funny you mentioned Hobbes, because I remember one of the critics of Hobbes was a Neoplatonist Anglican bishop named Cudworth, and he makes the same criticism of Hobbesian empiricism and materialism, which he saw as two sides of the same coin, and how it destroyed political concepts entirely. Because the political itself must be a conceptual principle. It must have an inner necessity that cannot be exhaustively understood in terms of practical life and like the sensuous world. For instance, Hobbes so banishes the concept of immateriality from anything he thinks that he can't even conceive of the simple idea, and rather plain idea, that the reason people come together in families or political communities is not to protect themselves from external harms, but say out of love. Which one would think is plain for a philosopher to see, at least as a possibility. But if you're so committed to this idea that there is no such thing as immaterial principles, said Cudworth, then you're going to be brought into this view of everything is chaos. Which in turn produces chaos, which is why Hegel's point is so sublime.
I've heard that name before. Yeah, I've heard Cudworth's name before, but I've never read any of his stuff. That sounds very interesting.
I want to read Ralph Cudworth now.
He's pretty good.
All right. Where was I? I think I finished that paragraph, right? But empiricism cannot attain to this absolute reflection or to an insight into the nullity of the characteristics in the absolute simple. The merely nullities remain for it a mass of realities. But to this multiplicity, the positive unity, expressing itself as absolute totality, must for empiricism be tacked on as something other and alien, and even this form of linkage of the two sides of absolute identity implies that their totality will be displayed just as murkily and impurely as that of the original unity. By the way, in I think it's in the difference essay, the difference of Fichte and Schelling systems, Hegel has a quote that I read elsewhere, citing it, saying how empiricism isn't even a valid epistemological position, that it's just a terrible and incomplete rationalism. So, something to look into.
There's also another great paper that I recommend anyone interested in epistemology or anti-empiricism to read, by George S. Beeler and Strawson, called The Incoherency of Empiricism. And they propose like 3 dilemmas to empiricists, and it's a great paper. It's not as sublime as Hegel for sure. It's a bit more just like standard analytic epistemology, but it really does a good job of, in like 30 pages, of showing why empiricism faces like intractable problems, and doesn't even rise to the level of epistemology, not as a genuine scientific study of the possibility of knowing, because again it rejects the idea of knowing logical principles out of hand. So of course it couldn't account for any scientific, truly scientific, right? Yada yada.
Technically, empiricism is like, it's like insane. It's literally, you'd be staring. It'd be like being dead. Like a real empiricism would be like, you might as well be dead. It's just nothing.
I think amoebas are empirical. They're probably empiricists.
Well, I mean, what's sense information from your 5 senses without a way to process that information? You know? Like, if you don't have a way to actually interpret that information, then what does it matter? You can't tell what's going on because you just can't tell.
Yeah, that's the problem with it.
Yeah, sure. What is clay without a potter, right? Like you can't get a vase, you can't get a whatever without something to shape it, right?
That's like always what like I don't understand about empiricists. It's a very basic point, but it still just holds like, okay, you see things, but why does it mean anything? Why are you able to say, oh, this is a ball, if you're only basing it from empirical knowledge rather than through reason?
Yeah, I find that that's when they get very dismissive, and they kind of want to assert that they can understand things, but then they don't want to commit to that.
All right. Let's continue. Empiricism does not find it difficult to offer grounds for one of these separated unities being for the other, or for the transition from one to the other, just as empiricism has in general no difficulty in offering grounds. After the fiction of the state of nature has served its purpose, that state is abandoned because of its ill consequences. This simply means that the desired outcome is presupposed, the outcome merely of an harmonization of what, as chaos, is in conflict with the good or whatever goal must be reached. Alternatively, a ground of transition is introduced directly into the idea of original qualities as potentialities, such as the gregarious instinct or the conceptual form of faculty is abandoned, and one proceeds at once to the purely particular side of the appearance of the second unity, that is, to something historical, such as the subjection of the weaker by the stronger, etc. But the unity itself can only proceed, as in empirical physics, according to the principle of an absolute quantitative multiplicity. In place of the many atomic qualities, it can only exhibit a multiplicity of parts or relations. Once again, nothing but multiplex complexities of the presupposedly original simple and separated multiple units. Superficial contact between these qualities, which in themselves are indestructible in their particularity, incapable of only light and partial interconnections and intermixtures. Insofar as the unity is posited as a whole, it is given the empty name of a formless and external harmony called society and state.
That's all still relevant. If you talk to any person who's a pragmatist about methodology, about anything, they'll basically say that they're nuanced. That's how they see it, as being nuanced, when it's really just blurry, vague, indeterminate, arbitrary things passing over irreverently. It's just unregulated, pure and simple. But it looks like nuance because you happen to have read a lot of empirical literature.
Mm-hmm. Oh, darn it. Okay. Even if the unity, whether in itself or regarded more empirically in relation to its emergence, is represented as absolute, deriving its immediate origin from God, and even if the center and inner essence of its existence may be represented as divine, this idea still remains something formal, merely hovering over the multiplicity, not penetrating it. Let God be recognized not only as the founder of the association, but also as its upholder, and in relation to the latter, let the majesty of the supreme power be recognized as his reflection and in itself divine. Even when the divine element in the association is something external to the associated many, who must be placed in relation to the element only as under its dominion, since the principle of this empiricism excludes the absolute unity of the one and the many. At this point of the relation, empiricism coincides with its opposite principle, for which abstract unity is the first thing, except that empiricism is not embarrassed by its inconsistencies arising from the mixture of things posited as specifically different, such as abstract unity and absolute multiplicity. For this very reason, it has the advantage of not closing the door to views which, apart from their purely material side, are appearances of a purer and more divine inner principle than can occur on the principle of opposition, under which alone mastery and obedience are possible. Alright, hold on, let me reread this. So let God be recognized not only as the founder of the association, but also as its upholder. In relation to the latter, let the majesty of supreme power be recognized as his reflection and in itself divine. Even then, the divine element in the association is something external for the associated many, who must be placed in relation to that element only as under its dominion, since the principle of this empiricism excludes the absolute unity of the one and the many. At this point, the relation empiricism coincides with the opposite principle, for which abstract unity is the first thing, except that the empiricism is not embarrassed by its inconsistencies arising from the mixture of things, positive specifically different, such as abstract unity and absolute multiplicity. Okay, so in positing, in going and saying all the things that there's only particulars, that there aren't actually universals or individuals at all, and then going ahead and say, but there is such a thing as the state or society, they have then committed to formalism implicitly. And formalism happens to have like the exact same problem, which the distinction of the one and the many is held as absolute. Makes sense. The state of nature and that majesty and divinity of the whole state of law, which is alien to individuals and therefore is single and particular, as well as the subject situation of absolute subjection under this supreme power, are the forms in which the fragmented moment of organic ethical life are fixed in particular essences and thereby distorted, just as the idea is. These moments are 1. The moment of absolute unity and of absolute totality, insofar as it incorporates the opposition of unity and multiplicity, and 2. The moment of infinity, the nullifying of the realities of this opposition. The absolute idea of ethical life, on the other hand, contains both majesty and the state of nature as simply identical, since the former is nothing but absolute ethical nature, and in the realization of majesty there can be no thought of any loss of absolute freedom, which is what would have to be understood by natural freedom, or of any sacrifice of ethical nature. But the natural, which would have to be regarded in an ethical relation as something to be sacrificed, would itself not be ethical, and so could least of all represent the ethical in its origin. Neither is infinity or the negation of individuals or subjects fixed in the absolute idea, nor in relative identity with majesty as a relation of servility in which individuality too would be something simply posited. On the contrary, in the idea, infinity is genuine, individuality as such is nothing and simply one with absolute ethical majesty, for which genuine, living, non-servile oneness is the only true ethical life of the individual. Sorry, just trying to find that again. Let me read that slower. So the state of nature, that majesty and divinity of the whole state of law, which is alien to individuals and therefore a single and particular, as well as the subject situation of absolute subjection under the supreme power, are the forms in which the fragmented moment of organic ethical life are fixed as particular essences and thereby distorted just as the idea is. Okay, so this is a form of the universal individual issue, where the universal is supposed to be this all-encompassing whole, but the universal as universal stands distinct from the particulars or individuals, and in doing so the universal itself is itself single and particular, as it says here, which is a contradiction. To moments of ethical life are fixed as particular essences and thereby distorted just as the idea is. These moments are: 1, the moment of absolute unity and of absolute totality insofar as it incorporates the opposition of unity and multiplicity, which would be the universal. The moment of infinity, the nullifying of the realities of this opposition. I'm not quite sure how he's distinguishing these. So the moment of absolute unity and of absolute totality insofar as it incorporates the opposition of unity and multiplicity. That makes sense to me. That's the universal, the concrete universal, perhaps. And 2, the moment of infinity, the nullifying of the realities of this opposition. That seems to be the finite infinite, as later formulates it in other places and later in his philosophy as well. So that seems to me like a distinction between concreteness and abstraction. Like the first, the moment of absolute unity, totality incorporates the opposition of unity and multiplicity. That seems like concreteness, and infinity, the nullifying of the realities of this opposition, seems like abstractness. The absolute idea of ethical life, on the other hand, contains both majesty and the state of nature as simply identical, since the former is nothing but absolute ethical nature, and in the realization of majesty there can be no thought of any loss of absolute freedom, which is what would have to be understood by natural freedom, or of any sacrifice of ethical nature. So, the absolute idea of ethical life contains both majesty, which would be the universal, the unity, the absolute unity, and the state of nature, which would be simply the empirical particulars, as simply identical, since the former is nothing but the absolute ethical nature. And in the realization of majesty, there can be no thought of any loss of absolute freedom. So, it's not an imposed form. It's not a sovereign forcing somebody, which is what would have to be understood by natural freedom, or of any sacrifice of ethical nature. But the natural, which would have to be regarded in an ethical relation as something to be sacrificed, would itself not be ethical, and so could least of all represent the ethical in its origin. Alright, he loses me here. So the idea is nothing but absolute ethical nature. And in the realization of majesty, there can be nothing of any loss of absolute freedom, which is what would have to be understood by natural freedom, or of any sacrifice of ethical nature.
He's distinguishing between ethical nature and nature, as in your naturalness, I think. Because he's suggesting that one would be sacrificed to the other, but
Yeah, that's where I was heading to. And like, there's the nature of freedom, and then there's nature as the natural domain of existent things, spatio-temporally. So he says, in the realization of majesty, there can be no thought of any loss of absolute freedom, which is what would have to be understood by natural freedom, or of any sacrifice of ethical nature. So if we had to ethically make a sacrifice, this would itself not be unfree. And that would be the ethical nature. But the natural, which would have to be regarded in an ethical relation as something to be sacrificed, would itself not be ethical, and so could least of all represent the ethical in its origin. Yeah, you're right. So neither is infinity or the negation of individuals or subjects fixed in the absolute idea, nor in relative identity with majesty as a relation of servility in which individuality too would be something simply posited. On the contrary, in the idea, infinity is genuine, individuality as such is nothing, and simply one with absolute ethical majesty, for which genuine living non-servile oneness is the only true ethical life of the individual. So this does not seem entirely proper to what Hegel develops later, because this is stated in too weird a thing. Later Hegel, unless he explains it later, and this is just a one-sided statement right here, individuality is certainly not nothing for Hegel. Although here, like the implication is not that the one as an individual disappears. It's just that the one as an individual is also one with the universal. So there's still an intelligibility in terms of what comes much later. But an odd statement nonetheless. We have accused scientific empiricism, so far as it is scientific, of the positive nullity and untruth of its principles, laws, etc., on the ground that it confirms the negative absoluteness of the concept on determinate features by means of the formal unity in which it places them, and it asserts them as existing positively, absolutely, and of themselves as end and destiny, principle, statute, duty, and law, forms that mean something absolute. But in order to acquire the unity of an organic relation which offers to this qualitative determination a mass of such concepts, one facet expressed as end, destiny, or statute, must be given primacy over the other facets of the multiplicity, and these must be posited as unreal and null by comparison with it. It is in this process of application and consistent reasoning that perception as an inner totality is nullified. It is therefore by inconsistency that this assumption of facets into the concept can be corrected, and the violence done to perception undone, because inconsistency immediately cancels the absolute character previously conferred on one facet. From this point of view, the old and thoroughly inconsistent empiricism must be justified, not in relation to absolute science as such, but in relation to the consistency of empirical scientific method, our subject so far. A great impure intuition can in this way express the truly ethical and the purely architectonic method of its exposition, in which the context of necessity and the domination of form do not visibly appear. It is like a building which silently displays the spirit of its creator in its outspread mass, although the image of the creator himself, concentrated into a unity, is not exhibited there. In such an exposition constructed with the help of concepts, it is due only to an unskillfulness of reason that it does not elevate into the ideal form that it comprises and penetrates, and does not become conscious of it therein as idea. If perception will only remain true to itself and not let itself be confused by the understanding, it will be awkward as regards its concepts which it needs to express itself. It will assume wrong shapes in its passage through consciousness, and will be both incoherent and self-contradictory concerning the concept. But the ordering of parts and self-modifying facets will betray the inner rationale, though invisible spirit. The inner rational, though invisible spirit. And insofar as the spirit's appearance here is regarded as product and its result, the product will, as product, completely correspond with the idea. So, all right. So as I understand that, this was kind of just going over how, like, the incoherency of empiricism is itself coherent precisely because of what it is. That it can't help but be incoherent, and when we understand it, we grasp its concept, and we see how it corresponds with the idea. Let me see how much longer this section is. Okay, so I thought this thing broke down into parts, but apparently not. Let's keep reading until he finishes talking about empiricism, and then that should probably signal the change of where we're at. For the understanding, nothing is easier than to pounce on this empiricism, to pose other grounds against these unskillful ones, to express the confusion and contradiction of its concept, to draw from separate propositions inferences which express the harshest and most irrational contradictions, and in all sorts of ways to display the unscientific character of empiricism. This serves empiricism right, especially if it either pretends to be scientific or adopts a polemical attitude to science as such. On the other hand, if specific characteristics are fixed, if the law is carried consistently through the aspects hunted up by empiricism, if intuition is made subordinate to them, and if, in short, what is generally called a theory is framed that empiricism is right to complain that this is one-sided, and that it is in its power by means of the completeness of the specific characteristics which it upholds to force this theory by citing certain instances into universality which is totally empty. Okay, this seems to set the transition for rationalism or formalism. So we will leave this here. So there's a paragraph break on page 70. Let me see. Ah, yes, there is a paragraph break. Okay, we'll continue on to 70 then. This restrictedness of concepts, the fixing of specific characteristics, the elevating of one selected aspect of appearance to universality and granting dominion over the others, has in recent years styled itself not just theory, but philosophy, and when it rose to emptier abstractions and ceased on pure negations such as freedom, pure will, humanity, etc., styled itself metaphysics, believing that it has produced philosophical revolutions in natural law, and especially in constitution and criminal law. It has lugged these sciences hither and thither with such baseless abstractions and positively stated negations such as freedom, equality, the pure state, etc., or with equally baseless features drawn from common experience like coercion, especially psychological coercion with its whole accompaniment of opposition between practical reason and natural impulses, and whatever else is at home in this psychology. And further, it has more or less consistently forced null concepts like these into the texture of a science in the guise of laws, rational ends, and rational principles. Empiricism rightly demands that such a philosophy should take its bearings from experience. It rightly sticks to its obstinate opposition to such an artificial framework of principles. It rightly prefers its own empirical inconsistency, grounded on an intuition, however dim, of a whole, to the consistency of such philosophizing. It rightly prefers its own confusion, for instance, of ethical life, morality, legality, or in more special case of punishment, of revenge, security of the state, reform, execution of a threat, deterrence, prevention, etc., whether from the point of view of science or practical life, to the absolute distinction of these different facets of one and the same intuition, and the characterization of the whole of these qualities by a single one of them. It rightly claims that the theory and this thing styling itself philosophy and metaphysics has no application and contradicts the necessities of practical life. This inapplicability would be better expressed by saying that in this theory and this philosophy there is nothing absolute, no reality, and no truth. Finally, empiricism rightly reproaches this philosophizing for its ingratitude on the ground that empiricism itself supplies it with the content of its concepts, and then must watch this content being corrupted and perverted by philosophizing. For empiricism offers the specific character of the content entangled and bound up with other specific characters, and this specific character is essentially an organic and living whole, which is killed by this dismemberment and this elevation of unsubstantial abstractions and details to absoluteness. If it were and remained pure itself, an empirical attitude would have every right to assert itself against such theorizing and philosophizing, and to treat the mass of principles, ends, laws, duties, and rights as not absolute, but as distinctions important for the culture through which its own vision becomes clear to it. But when empiricism seems to go to war with theory, it usually turns out that the one, like the other, is a vision already contaminated and superseded by reflection and a perverted reason. And what is alleged to be an empirical method is only weaker in abstraction and has been less self-sufficient in distinguishing and fixing its restricted concepts, which it has not itself selected. On the contrary, it is entangled in such concepts as have become fixed in the culture of the day as healthy common sense, and so seem to have been drawn directly from experience. The picture of the struggle between such hardened and ad hoc conventionally fixed abstractions is necessarily just as checkered as the opponents themselves. Each uses against the other now an abstraction, now a so-called experience, and on both sides empiricism founders on empiricism, and narrowness on narrowness. Now principles and laws are boastfully advanced against philosophy, and philosophy is set aside as incompetent to judge of such absolute truths in which the understanding is stuck. Now philosophy is misused for the purpose of ratiocination in the name of philosophy. This relative right, which, when perception is its ruling element, was conceded to empiricism over against the mating of the empirical and the product of reflection, refers, as will be remembered, to its unconscious inner nature. But the middle term between this inner nature and its external appearance, that is consciousness, is the point where its insufficiency, that is, its one-sidedness, lies, and its drive against the scientific and incomplete connectedness, as its mere brush with the concept whereby it is only contaminated, arises from the necessity that multiplicity and finitude be absolutely engulfed in infinity or universality. Okay, and there we go. That finishes that section on empiricism. All right. pretty good. Nothing exactly entirely new to me, but there is some new stuff. The way he's relating it to natural right or natural law, particularly the state of nature, is interesting. I've never seen that before. But anyways, for those of you listening, hopefully you find this interesting. See you next time.